James, let's now talk about lens options for the Blackmagic Cinema camera. We've got quite a range here. I guess the first thing we should talk about is the size of the sensor and the impact that has on focal length. Now, a phrase that's often bandied around it is, what's the crop factor? So for those of you who like to think in terms of crop factors, this has a 2.3 times crop factor compared to full frame DSLR. So this is a 50mm Zeiss CP2 on a Canon 5D Mark II. So I guess if we do that, this 50mm lens on the Blackmagic Cinema camera with its smaller sensor would have an equivalent field of view 2.3 times greater than 50mm. So it doesn't change the focal length. A 50mm lens on this camera is still a 50mm lens. However, the effective field of view is going to be that equivalent of putting a 150mm lens on the DSLR. So you just get a narrower field of view. So it has the effect of magnifying the field of view. So when you use a longer lens, like a 7200, you get something much, much greater. That's, for me, kind of all there is to this. I don't get too hung up on crop factor. What's more important is, what are the lenses we use and why? Now, being a cinema camera, I rather like this, it's just parked on top of here. Being a cinema camera, I'm fortunate I've got CP2s. We've used them on a number of occasions. They give a most beautiful quality. I tend to probably accept that they're only really good in ideal conditions outdoors or in a studio environment. Because the sensor is smaller on the Blackmagic camera, if there's any wind noise at all, you get a bit of vibration on the lens and it's accentuated on the smaller sensor. So in a studio environment, I tend to use CP2s if possible, doing music videos, that kind of thing. When I'm traveling, I tend to use these Zeiss ZF2s with just a Nikon to Canon adapter, because these are Nikon mount lenses, because that gives me an on-lens aperture which allows me to set my depth of field and then just use ND filters, variable neutral density, or regular NDs on the front of the lens in the same way you do with DSLRs. But you have a kind of different set of lenses because you shoot different styles of work. So talk me through the kind of lenses you use on this camera. And again, the CP2s are great because you've got these interchangeable mounts, so you can put the Canon mount on there. But obviously you lose those contact points, so there is no image stabilization on lenses of this size. And so despite the fact these lenses are very, very high quality optically and lovely, I think 14 blade leaf aperture, they have some limitations in the kind of work that you do specifically, don't they?
Well, I mean, so in front of me I've got predominantly, these are all going to a Canon mount basically, and this is a lens collection I built up because I used to shoot with Canon cameras. So to start with, I'm using the lenses that I have, but it works well for me because a lot of the work that I do means that I need to work single-handedly, very small, kind of compact, and being able to utilize image stabilizing, like my workhorse zoom lens is definitely this. It's the 17 to 55mm EFS Canon lens. It's a fixed aperture of 2.8, and that's great because it means that at any point I can change my focal length on the lens, but my aperture is going to remain the same. But its real benefit on the cinema camera is image stabilizing, and this basically turns this lens and that camera into a fantastic run and gun workhorse kind of documentary rig.
And it's the lens that Matt's using here on this camera to zoom in and out for the close-ups on this table. It's a great focal range, isn't it?
Completely. And I was originally concerned when I looked at the specs of the size of the sensor, because I thought, okay, so what's it going to mean? It's going to mean that, you know, my standard sort of 50mm lens is it's going to become more like 150. It's not going to be giving me that same field of view that I'm expecting from it. It's going to give me more of a telephoto.
And that you're used to.
Yeah.
Because, you know, a lot of this is down to what you're used to getting on a DSLR, for example. So there's just a bit of adapting to understand that that is one of the limitations of this camera, is that the smaller sensor means that your wider lenses aren't going to be as wide. And James, one thing I've heard repeatedly is, oh, it's no good because of the small sensor, you can't get wide. What's your solution for getting wide on this camera?
Well, I mean, immediately my go-to lens most of the time for any wide shots is my Tokina 11 to 16 mil, and it's a fixed 2.8 aperture. It's a beautiful lens. I think it's a great piece of glass.
This lens actually is one of the best kept non-secrets in the industry, in that the optics from this lens are used in the Duclos modified 11 to 16. They're used in a couple of Chinese and Japanese Cine modded 11 to 16s. I think they're the same optics that are in the Zuno lenses, costing £3,000 or £4,000. That 11 to 16 focal length, Tokina have absolutely nailed.
Yeah, and with the crop factor in mind on a cinema camera, at 11 mil, you're going to be getting more, closer to kind of a 24, 25 mil, which is, your standard wide. Now, if I need to go wider than that, then that's where the Sigma 8 to 16 mil comes in really, really handy, because although it's not as fast, because it's a f 4.5 to 5.6, at 8 mil on this, you're getting an equivalent in full frame terms of about 18 mil, which is a good wide.
To be honest, in cinema terms, a wide angle lens.
Yeah.
And so unless you're working in a really tight space, I mean, interesting, this shot here, the master shot, is a 21mm Zeiss CP2, and we framed this such, which I think is quite a comfortable focal length. If I wanted to get super wide in this very small studio light you can see on this camera up here, then you'd need something much, much wider. But you can make it work by just getting the camera further back, can't you?
Completely, yeah. I've found that, okay, I'm not using this 50 1.2 as much, but what I have been using with the camera is I've been using this Sigma 24 1.8, and this Sigma becomes basically my fast 50 on a cinema camera. It's giving me closer to a sort of 55mm field of view in a full frame terms, and that's great. It works really, really nicely. So it's just taking the sensor size into account and looking at the range of lenses, and there's enough lenses to be able to go wide.
And James, when we did the project down at New Covent Garden Market, which we're going to see a whole case study on later on in this programme, we did some specific stuff in the market where you were using the 70 to 200 and getting really quite impressive results, because you could be so far back, shoot through things. So is it true that having a smaller sensor kind of forces you into a different style of shooting by the very nature of it?
Well, there's clearly a flip side to the point that people are looking at the smaller sensor being all about a bad thing because your lenses don't go wide enough. Well, the flip side is that actually it can be really useful when you want to get more of a telephoto effect from your lenses. And one application for that, which I think is invaluable, is when you're doing live documentary work, live filming. That's when you always want your lenses to go further. We spent a long time rigging the right lens to use on the Duran Duran project just so we could get cinema-looking images from the back of the venue. And actually having a smaller sensor and being able to put, say, a 70 to 200, or even to go further, but a 70 to 300 on there, you're going to be getting closer to sort of between 480, 6 to 600. You're going to be getting really nice controlled telephoto shots.
It's interesting, if we were to do that Duran Duran project again, I'd find it very hard not to consider shooting it on this camera.
Well, I've always maintained I think this is going to be an excellent camera for live work, not just because of the advantage of the smaller sensor for making your lenses go further, but also because of the post workflow. Straight to ProRes would be perfect.
I was out at the weekend just doing some test filming in that kind of environment, shooting the Jive Aces, and I took 70 to 200, the Sigma, and I think I had the 16 to 35 Canon as well. And as you can see from these clips, I was able to get, I was quite close to the stage, it wasn't a huge venue, but I was able to get all the things I needed from wide, and I was probably 5 feet from the stage at one point on the 8 to 16, but from the same position change lenses and get up to 200mm focal length and be punching into super big close-ups of hands on double bases, They had this singer girl singing with them, and get really super tight in. So for that kind of music environment, and I don't do nearly as much of it as you do, but it was interesting. That was the time when I wasn't going to take my CP2s. I wanted the image stabilization because people were dancing and the floor was bouncing, and it doesn't eliminate all of the problems, but it certainly makes it easier. And I think if you can take an image stabilized lens and reduce some of the artifacts from movement optically, and then stick it into your edit, and either stick it through Warp Stabilizer in Adobe or stick it into the stabilizing engine in Final Cut, you're just helping yourself along the way, because ultimately it doesn't really matter how you captured it, as long as you captured it, and when it goes out, it impresses an audience.
Completely. It's the interesting kind of bleeding edge of where traditional cinema and cinema tools and cameras are now meeting this kind of new world of utilizing electronics in lenses, and it's only going to get more interesting from here, definitely.
And there's certainly still very much a place for high quality optics. I think we're going to do a still life commercial or something where we just had a bit more control. You wouldn't think twice about using these lenses because they add that little bit extra. And I think when you get to a certain level of professionalism, and certainly what I think we very much believe to be a philosophy, it's those little differences that make the difference. You are looking for that extra 1 or 2% here or there, and it might be that this lens is £3,500, and you can buy 2 or 3 of those lenses for the same money. I'm not saying that one's better than the other. It just depends on what's appropriate for the job. And you know what? You don't need to buy this stuff. You can rent it. It's about deciding what is your ideal shooting package, and does it give you versatility. And I know that you will pretty much cover everything you need. It has to be in one bag, doesn't it?
For a lot of the work I do, yeah, it's all down to the job essentially, and the requirements of the job. So I like the 9 Elms film, which we'll look at later on. The requirements for that was that I had to only take on that shoot what I could carry. So that basically boiled down to using the 17 to 55 lens, the 11 to 16, and the 70 to 200. And
so you basically, that was your 3 lenses for that project.
Those 3 lenses. And from here we can go all the way from 11mm to 200mm. This gives us a great kind of working, and everything at f2.8.
Yeah. Which,
even though we shot at night, was great. It worked fine.
So James, you're not just restricted to Canon mount lenses just because it's a Canon mount camera, are you?
No, not at all. In fact, what we've got here is we've got a couple of Nikon lenses. And this is a beautiful old, it's from the 70s. This lens I've had for a long time. It's a beautiful old Nikon f1.2, but I've got it adapted to a Canon mount, just using a photo deox adapter, a pretty cheap one at that, to be honest. And that allows me to get it onto the front of the camera, and then just to use the manual aperture on the lens, something which you're doing actually with your ZFs.
Yeah, exactly the same. The ZFs are Nikon mount, as I mentioned earlier, and you can just, I personally like being able to change my aperture on the barrel of the lens, just because it's something I've been brought up, I'm used to doing. And this is again got an inexpensive adapter. Certainly you can adjust the iris in the back of the camera. It's one of these things, coming from a shooter's background, I like to be able to adjust my iris on the lens, because I might rack iris during a shot, and it's just muscle memory from doing this for 20 years. When I'm shooting, I know what I'm going to get.
But of course, it should be noted that when you're working with the camera with any manual aperture lens, so any lens where basically you're not passing electronic data between the lens and the camera body, the iris button on the back is going to become inactive, because the iris button will only actually function and be active and allow you to auto expose when you're using a lens which is passing electronic data. So in essence, a Canon EF lens or one of the Zeiss ZE lenses.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's take these out now and actually do a little shootout. I think what would be really interesting is, and this sort of ties back into this whole accessibility thing, I come from very much an optics background, a shooting background, where I want the best optics and the best tools. You come from the post background, obviously, and from a DSLR background where you've had these lenses, but I think where in the past I've been less keen to use these lenses because I feel as a DP they're sort of not going to give me as quite a high resolution as these lenses, is that because of your background in post, you know that you're going to acquire this and have scope to do things with the image in post. So it'll be interesting to pit these lenses side by side. I think what we're going to find is that almost certainly the CP2s and the ZFs are going to deliver sharper, higher contrast, warmer pictures than the Canons, but we're in the UK, it's January, we're going to be going to Southwold, which is not going to be particularly pleasant weather-wise. It's going to be cold, potentially windy, and I think it'll be really interesting to put these cameras on a tripod side by side and see what the difference is optically, and then also when it gets to certain focal length, I think you're going to start winning because of your image stabilization. And then you're faced with, well, am I, as a DP, going to be sort of really anal about, no, we've got to use the best optics and wait for the weather to change, or are we going to get the shots using image stabilization that means we can move on and get through the schedule? Be an interesting little challenge, head to head, traditional glass versus image stabilized glass. What do you reckon?
I think we should try it out.
Let's do it.